that. And then we have the Reverend Rob Stevens, recently ordained in the United Church of Christ. Also Hershey's husband. Have you all met Rob? Maybe you better stand up, Rob. I know. And Rob's dad is here also a reverend, right? No, not, but a missionary in Africa. So you met our family, right? So great. Well, welcome. We're so happy you're here. What we're going to do today is we'll start with a very short video about the mule train. Do you remember what the mule train was all about in the first Poor People's Campaign? Okay, you'll find out from the video. And then I'll have our guests come up. We'll do a little discussion. And then we have another very short video about the Poor People's Campaign of today that's being led by the Reverend William Barber and the Reverend Liz Theo Harris. And Rob has worked with that campaign from the outset. He'll be able to tell us what it's all about and how it ties back into Martin Luther King's vision of creating beloved community. So with that, let's start. Justin, if you would.
I was trying to understand what was going on in America. I couldn't understand why all these people were being killed and what forces in the country was creating this and why. You're young, so you think this is supposed to be a democracy.
Roland Freeman found his calling in the spring of 1968. Drawn to the ideals of the civil rights movement, he came to Marks, Mississippi to document the journey of the mule train. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned the mule train as part of a national Poor People's Campaign. But King died before it started. The caravan moved through the South to join some 50,000 protesters in the nation's capital. The mule train was Freeman's very first project, the first in a long career devoted to documentary photography.
This was the first undertaking of its type that I ever ventured to try. And I basically thought I knew what I was doing, but I really didn't. I had no tape recorder with me. I had cheap cameras that weren't the greatest. I was watching what was going on and taking pictures here and there. I had never been to school for photography. It was all a matter of feel, you see. And some days, you know, were better than others. But it seemed like I was constantly moved by the spirit of the people. Going down the highway never ceased to amaze me when you see people's reaction to the mule train. Folks that didn't have hardly nothing sharing everything they had with you. I mean, y'all come over here, I'm cooking some cornbread. I'm making coffee. They gave you what they had from the heart. They wish you well from the heart. Black folks, they understood. People brought their children out. They were holding up their babies. They wanted you to see what was happening. Folks understood. Nobody thought it was a joke.
Passing through the South, not everyone was pleased to see the mule train come to town.
Seeing those people who purposely came by to frighten the mules, to run you off the highway, people could be killed. I mean, the mules get frightened and run down an embankment. Folks be jumping off of wagons. People be getting hurt. You couldn't believe it. You know, when you crawl up in a wagon at night to sleep, and some stupid person is shooting, and you got women and children, man. What kind of animals were they? There were some bright moments, and one of them was when I saw these white students from a college in the Delta races. You know, and I went on to find that was a lot of other people like that in the years that I spent in the state. What I learned while being involved in this venture has sustained me ever since. I saw the courage of these frontline civil rights fighters. Those people who seemed like they stepped out of the Margaret Walker poem called For My People. The fear that I had at the time, they showed me the way with their love and understanding. I have never forgotten it. And you got to the soul again.
Great. So while Justin's putting up the screen, let me invite you all to come up to the stage and sit wherever you're most comfortable. This way, Rob, I think. Yeah, we can move the podium. Thank you. To set the context a little bit for this discussion, we chose the video of the mule train because it showed a human side of this struggle and of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And when we listened to people discussing the... Thank you, Ed. When we listened to them discussing their experiences in their life and ministry of Dr. King, I think it's important that we remember that we're in a moment today where it's very clear that while a lot of great work has been done, there's so much more to do to exorcise the demons of racial discrimination. The Poor People's Campaign, sorry, when he was assassinated. So I'll come up and join you. It doesn't work? Yeah, I know, here. Voila. Okay. So welcome, and thank you all for agreeing to share your personal reflections today. As always in these forums, we're looking for an indication from what we're discussing of what St. John's can do to make a difference. And so as we listen to your reflections, I hope you'll share with us any thoughts you all have on how this pertains to the work we do here in our parish as we help to develop beloved community in our community. But Ed, I'd like to start with you, because when we spoke, you told me that you had the pleasure of going to graduate school with Martin Luther King, and I thought people here might be interested in hearing about that experience and your understanding of the man and how that impacted your life and work as an Episcopal priest.
It's wonderful to see all of you here and to be able to share just a few moments. Can you hear me okay out there? Yeah, okay, good. Obviously, I go back a few years, and I was in college out in the Midwest and got my undergraduate degree and decided I would go to Boston University Theology School for several reasons. I discovered that Martin Luther King had had his theological education in Montgomery down south, and that he was going to come to Boston University because the professors were well known for their work in social justice, and he was eager to hone his skills, if you will. And so I got up to Boston University graduate school, and there was a young black man who was in the same a graduate school class that I was, and we crossed paths very often, got to know each other, and it turned out that he had the same major professor that I did, so we would often meet outside the professor's office, one of us going in and one of us going out. And the relationship developed over time into something very special, beyond being in the graduate school together and beyond simply going into ministry together, but the realization that I was with someone who was investing his life in what was at that time, and still is in its own way, a critical issue. So we would go back and forth to the graduate school. We would meet outside the professor's office where we both had appointments with him. And then we graduated and went our way. And I went to a church downtown Washington on 16th Street, just right up from the White House, and made only one slight mistake this morning. She said, I'm an Episcopal priest.
Sorry. You're not.
I'm a Methodist priest, but we don't usually call us priests. I'm a Methodist preacher, but we're the same family, by the way.
And very close to an agreement, hopefully.
Very, hopefully, you said. So I became minister of Foundry Methodist Church, which is downtown Washington on 16th Street, just right across, right up from the White House, as a matter of fact.
And a church well known for social justice work, right? Very well known for social justice.
Oh, yes, yes. It's a church that was grounded in social justice, partly, I think, due to my being there, but there were other reasons as well. So the day came when we got the news of what had happened in Memphis, and the city went up in flames, is the best way to put it. The whole area around 16th Street, 15th Street, 14th Street, the folks started going crazy with anger, and they started burning things. And so many of the houses and businesses had the front windows smashed, and it looked like, you remember seeing pictures of London after some of the bombings, the hoses out in the street and the damage and the debris. It was exactly like that around that downtown area when the news came out that Martin had been killed. The next morning,
Here, let me help.
Washington had a headline, King assassinated in Memphis. That was, what's the date on that paper?
The date is April 5th, Friday, April 5th, 1968.
1968.
Yeah.
How many of you were alive in 1968? Okay? So this is a memory from your lifetime. And you may remember, I don't know where you were or what you went through, but everything changed for a while in the church where I was the minister. It was like a war zone for the first 2 or 3 days after the assassination. There were hoses in the street, and there were store windows smashed and other things going on. And so I sent the members of the church staff home to get out of the war zone. But the irony is we had a preschool in the church, and the parents were unable to get through immediately. And so my heroic story of the time of the assassination was sitting with a group of children in a big circle, telling stories to each other and trying to console each other until the parents were finally able to get through and to take their children home. So this is where I was. I was down on 16th Street, the minister of a church that had started a preschool program for mostly black children, not all, but mostly black children. And when Martin was killed, I had my personal grief to deal with because he was a friend. And I had the problem of the situation around. There were many people around the church who were in their apartments where they lived, and they were afraid to come out. So the first thing we did was to organize a food campaign to get food into people who were afraid to come out at the time. And there was a lot of the city burning at that time. It was like London after an air raid in downtown Washington after Martin was assassinated. But this is a headline that was burned into my memory. King assassinated in Memphis. The memory I had, it was the Palm Sunday weekend coming up, and when we drove to church the next Sunday, because I was determined to have a church service in spite of the damage and in spite of the fact that it was a threatening situation to many people. There was a National Guard soldier on almost every corner on the way down because the National Guard had been called out to try to control the rioting that was going on. How many of you remember some of those details, your personal memories? So you were there, and I was there in the midst of all that. Do you have a question?
I was in Chicago, a college student in Chicago at 19 and it's exactly what happened there too.
The same thing happened in Chicago.
Right.
Yes, all right.
We were loudspeakers that were closing the university.
Yes.
Home immediately, and it was on fire.
Yes. Well, many people erupted in anger, and the anger resulted in violence of one kind or another. And so I was there in the midst of it with a lot of little children and taking care as best I could of my own grief, my own sorrow of losing a friend in not realizing all that was going to happen in the time that was ahead. The fact of the matter is that just before this, Martin had gone to many places. He'd gone to Memphis. He'd gone back to Montgomery and had the march down there. He'd gone to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and given one of his famous speeches. And his personal sacrifice, which in a sense we had actually talked about in a couple of those times when we were waiting for our professor to see us in school, in graduate school, had come to him, and working our way through that and into the future was part of the very personal, very painful period of my life. I obviously can go on and talk far too long, and the hour is going.
We can definitely have more discussion during Q&A, but Ed, thank you for sharing that personal memory, and it segues very well into what I hope Joe will talk about. Joe mentioned to me when we were talking before this session that the biggest lesson he learned from Martin Luther King Jr. is that the work is local, and you mentioned the work you were doing locally. The work we want to do at St. John's locally. So maybe Ed Joe, would you maybe explain a little bit about what you meant? That was the biggest impact that Martin Luther King had on your ministry and work?
Well, thank you, Ann, and thank you, Ed. Good morning. I was, one of the things that strikes me, when I was in seminary, I started seminary the day after Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech. And it totally, in Washington, at least, it sort of was a transformative moment. If you were in school, we picked up a set of ideals that I never would have gotten had I been in Kansas City or Denver. One of the things to remember back then, if you were here, people were frightened because they thought there would be trouble because they'd never seen so many black people together in one place at one time. And that day, that Sunday, when he gave the speech, the expectation was that all the people on the mall were to leave by 5 o'clock. It's hard to imagine that in 2019, but at the time, it was just a growth of understanding in the 60s. And what you got out of seminary, not to be a spiritual director, but to change the world. There was a whole different attitude from today to back then. And for me, I went to Baltimore. One of the things that strikes me about the people that were involved in the civil rights movement was that they were not angry. And that's so different than today. Because if you were angry, you were not to be involved in any frontline kind of activities, because you'd get spit on, you'd be pushed, shoved, and it was hard. And it was local. In Baltimore, we didn't have voting problems. There were lots of problems in Baltimore, and when we talk about the Poor People's Campaign, back then, the issue that came up was hunger. And we worked, the religious community was working on hunger issues. And one of the things that we did, there was Abraham Schusterman from the Jewish community, Lawrence Cardinal Sheehan from the Roman Catholic community, and David Layton, the Bishop of the Episcopal Church, and he appointed me to be part of a committee, and we got school lunches being able to be delivered in school cafeterias. At the time, in 1967, in Baltimore, they did not put a cafeteria in an elementary school unless the kids could afford to buy the food. And so there were no cafeterias in the poor neighborhoods. And we coupled with Johns Hopkins, and this is part of what I meant by being local, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health suggested that we put the school lunches in 4 different elementary schools and then do a study on student behavior, attendance, and performance. And they did that work. We got the lunches, and we raised the money to put the lunches in 4 different schools, and empirically could prove that the attendance improved, the disciplinary problems diminished, and student performance increased. And that kind of evidence enabled the schools in Baltimore to change their policy to feed poor people. And that was where I learned about how important it was that things were always going to be local. I did a sermon a few months back about, where you are is where it's at, and that was really where I learned that, and so. That's what we did when I was in Connecticut. We had a soup kitchen. When I was in Ascension in Gaithersburg, we did a program for students that were suspended from the local high school, and we had the parish involved in tutoring suspended students every day for the time I was there. So anyway, it was always local. And what I think, Dr. King did not invent the Montgomery bus boycott. That was there. He was at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and it presented itself as a local issue. It got national attention, but it started locally.
And it's the sanitation workers strike, too.
The same thing in Memphis.
Right.
But that was always, it seems to me, that was the organizational genius of the civil rights movement, was that people in Bethesda or Gaithersburg were not trying to solve problems in Raleigh, North Carolina, or Birmingham, Alabama.
Is local.
Yes.
Well, thank you. And that's also a great segue to Rob's work today with the New Poor People's Campaign. I would like you to tell us whatever you would like to give us as background on that. Rob has worked with the NAACP in North Carolina and with Dr. Barber, Reverend Barber also. But could you tell us, based on, Ed, Joe mentioned sort of the big vision that you came out of seminary with to change the world, but the importance that both Ed and Joe mentioned of working locally. I think there's something similar going on with the New Poor People's Campaign, and maybe you can reflect on how the past is affecting the future.
Yeah, I did not meet Dr. King in seminary, unfortunately, but we've all met Dr. King in different ways, and so it's wonderful to get the personal history and perspective on him. Dr. King has become gets twisted into all sorts of different uses. I think the Super Bowl ad most recently, he was used, his I Have Dreams speech was used to sell a Volvo or something, and which is just astounding. So there has definitely been a Santa Clausification of Dr. King, and as Hershey mentions in the sermon, dust him off when it's convenient. And so wonderful to hear these perspectives. The time, especially in '68, there was a great, what they call, two-line, three-line struggle in the movement, where Black Power and civil rights was really trying to figure out what was next. And there was some convergence of that. Dr. King getting much more militant as he gets later in his years, focusing in on poverty, focusing on economics, but also still holding a very strong anti-racist line, and being pushed by the younger generation of Black Power at the time. And sometimes we want to separate these movements, that there's the nice civil rights and then the mean the mean people, and there's certainly not that to separate them is to lose sight of the history of it, and that they were interacting with each other constantly and influencing each other constantly, and holding people's imagination. One thing before I segue into today, I think it's important, Ibram Kendi's book, it says the myth of racism in our country is that, in somewhat in the misuse of Dr. King, the myth of racism is that, there's hatred and ignorance is the foundation. We think that hatred, ignorance, and mean-spiritedness and interpersonal type of interactions being the foundation of racism. If we can fix the ignorance, then we'll fix racism. But that's actually ahistorical. That's not how historically it's developed. The foundation was racist policies, a structured system that benefited people who would eventually become white and oppressed, Black people in this country and indigenous people. So that structure that benefited people is the foundation. It wasn't a personal thing. It was just how to make an economy work to make people money. And then on top of that is where racist ideas come up. So that's where you get the scientific justification of racism. That's where you get the theological justification of racism that is the foundation of this country. This idea of manifest destiny and that, a whole history behind that. So the racist ideas are what keep the racist structure in place, because you need those racist ideas. And then that, out of the racist ideas, is where you get hate and ignorance. And so that's the superficial level, but one of the tricks of our modern society is to make us focus on that only, that it's just about if we can treat each other better, if we were just nicer to each other, if we were more polite, and then we could fix this 400-year history of racism. But certainly Dr. King, if you haven't been made uncomfortable by Dr. King, then please go read some more and listen to some more speeches, and the ones that aren't just the tidbits. But people take out that I Have Dreamed, just a part of it, about the color of our skin. and make that the foundation of racism. So that's just one thing. The local piece is great, because that is what Dr. King said in the I Have a Dream speech, is go back to Memphis, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, go back, they came to DC, but it was about local action. And your associate rector was central to the Episcopal Church becoming a part of the New Poor People's Campaign. And so last year was the 50th anniversary, and we'll see a video later, to reignite the Poor People's Campaign. And in this sense, it did become local. And so it was focused in 41 states. We had the actions that were here. Was it Margaret?
Yes, Margaret Hill.
I met Margaret. She was getting arrested here in D.C. and was at the church. That's where we met. But also across the country. It was happening in local places, and people coming together to focus on their own state issues, which is what we think also the extremist reactionary right wing did, is focused on states. So state policies, years ago, that they had a good plan for that. So it was focusing on states, it's local, and Hershey became the model for all the other denominations to engage in the Poor People's Campaign. And so when the national church, this isn't recorded, right?
Actually, it is.
Every institutions are not meant to be radical, so every institution is going to resist at first something like this. But Hershey got a lot of other people, like the deacons in Alabama, all these local people, to start pushing to get the national church to endorse it, and eventually got, and she's on the board of Repairs of the Breach, which was the sponsor of it with Reverend Barber's organization, and eventually got Reverend Barber to Skype into some board meeting. I don't know y'all's polity. Executive council, and he started talking about the Bible study he was going to, and it charmed everyone, and got the executive council to make a declaration of endorsing it, and then that also just kind of built. So there's the local piece, and then how can the national group also support local people in the organizing effort, but yeah, so if you really want to know about the Poor People's Campaign Episcopal Church, Hershey's who you should talk to. But it is continuing to build. They had 41 states. I think it was 2,000-something people participated in civil disobedience and were arrested in state capitals across the country. It's continuing in local ways. There's a Maryland steering committee and organizing group. There's a DC one. There's a Virginia one. And there'll be more activities coming up this summer in DC, and then with a big People's Congress planned for 2020 ahead of the 2020 elections, where there'll be a mass mobilization and encampment and the whole thing here in DC, which of course St. John's could be a part of supporting and hosting, and as that evolves.
And maybe you could just say 2 words, and then we'll go to Q&A about the goals of the new Poor People's Campaign.
So, the speech in '67, Beyond Vietnam, he identified the triple evils that Hershey also mentioned in the sermon of racism.
Dr. King identified.
Yeah, Dr. King did. Racism, materialism, which poverty, and militarism. And so the New Poor People's Campaign has taken those on and added ecological devastation as one of them, as the focuses. And so there's an agenda. It's important to what Reverend Barber always says, if you don't want to be loud and wrong. So he says, so there's a very well-researched agenda about what is actually happening in this country, what's happened since 50 years ago, what's gotten worse, what's gotten better, and then making policy suggestions and things that we're fighting for. And so they're organized around those things about racism, poverty, militarism, or the war economy, and ecological devastation, fighting in a way that brings all those issues together, knowing that you can't pick them apart. That they're totally intersected in the way they manifest in our country.
Okay. Maybe we'll take some Q's and A's now and then close with the video about the Poor People's Campaign. So, questions? And I may need to borrow one of your microphones. Comments or questions? If not, yeah, okay, Catherine.
I'd just like to have Joe talk a little bit more, if you would, about the local. Why is that more potent? Is it the specificity? Is it harder to ignore?
Well, thank you, Catherine. What I've experienced is that if it's local, it's personal, and that people. I mean, we're Episcopalians. We love to talk about ideas, but that doesn't get you anything in a real way. If you're hungry, you need a meal. If you're sick, you need somebody to help take care of you. And for me, that the people in the parish, they wanted to do something and to be active and sort of hands-on. And so we paid a lot of attention to what was happening in our own neighborhood, in our own community. When I was at Ascension, we were transformed by what started with one lady coming at the 8 o'clock service and saying, "Can somebody bring communion to my father who's dying?" She was from Liberia. 4 years later, we had 400 or 500 people from Liberia as members of the church, because they were immigrants, and like the Irish in Boston, they came to where people were, and they could get insight into where jobs and housing was, and so there was just this huge influx of people, and they transformed our church in many ways. But it just started with somebody wanting communion for her father who was dying. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, that's what's been the ministry, and the parish is what makes the difference. I don't know that the Diocese of Washington has made a big difference, but I know that a lot of parishes have made an enormous difference, and so I would, that's just what we did, and it worked for us.
Could I just add a quick word to continue this idea? We had a custom at our church during the pastoral prayer time to have collected special requests from people and put them on the altar. And of course, we couldn't read them all during the service, but I would go up and kneel at the altar and pick out, just at random, some cards, and I found myself, soon after the things I described a moment ago, reading this card. How can anybody be happy about the birth of a black child, my unborn grandchild? I'm sorry. I'm sorry it is to be born, as my son has already been hurt so much. God help us to be brothers and sisters. Nobody can understand what it is to be daily black in a white man's world. But maybe there is hope with the young. Please pray for us. What do? You're kneeling at the altar for the pastoral prayer. That is the prayer. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about. And it's wonderful. We immediately spring into movements and organizations and wonderful things that have happened. But ultimately, it goes back. It goes back to that grandmother's request for prayer that Sunday morning. So I just wanted to add that spirit.
No, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Rob, I know that the Newport People's Campaign does organize locally, and when we see the video, they have some excellent examples of impact on local lives. Maybe you could say a word about that.
Yeah, I think the history of the Poor People's Campaign is inspired by the 150 years ago, but also is deeply influenced by the Moral Monday campaign that occurred in North Carolina, which was a long history of organizing to focus on state capitals, because that's often what is, we think about the president, the Senate, and the Congress a lot at the national level. We might think about the school board because we have kids that go there, or they're our neighbors, the city council, but in between is the state legislators, which control control an enormous amount of money when it comes to education, healthcare, and in many ways that impact people's daily lives. And so sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. So that's part of the reasons that it's always focused on state capitals and policy at that level, because they also control, as we know, redistricting. And so a lot of the problems that we've been running into is been gerrymandering on the local level by state legislators that ultimately control national policy. And then also, a deep look at the South as the block that needs to be broken is a focus, but certainly there's the South everywhere. But as far as electorally, so that's some of the thinking behind why state legislators are focused on.
Any other questions or comments? Sorry, I have to kind of be into doing it all.
I could use my teacher voice, but I'll use the microphone.
I'll stay back.
I'm just wondering from any of you, like, how you see, I hear Joe and everyone talking about the importance of local, like, sort of direct action or service, and I hear Rob talking more about the systemic issues, and I wonder, sort of individually and as a community, how do we look at both at the same time? Like, how do we think about ways to feed people and also think about addressing the structural issues of why people are hungry in the first place? Where's the balance? What do you all see in terms of looking at things from both sides?
Thank you. Thank you, Moni. Here you go. Okay.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think she's just asking about the balance. So
Yeah.
working on the ground, there's the grassroots aspect of it, but there's the systemic institutional, there are the systemic institutional issues that give rise to those. So where's the balance in our choices for action and our choices for our time and our money in this movement moving forward to make a change in both places?
Well, I remember the Poor People's Campaign, and I went down there on the mall, and I think that one of the problems that it had was trying to change Congress. I don't think anybody's been able to change Congress, and it's much worse now than it was then. So if I've got 3 hours to spend, I think that for Joe Clark anyway, I think I want to spend it trying to deal with something that's happening where I live, and I mean, there's systemic racism and structural issues in our in our society, but I don't think I can do anything about those. And maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, I would differ with you, because the very example that you gave showed how the local effort you started with school lunches resulted in changing a system, right, at the state level, and it got school lunches in all the schools. So the work done at the local level can have that ramification. And I think the answer is you have to work at both levels and take what you're doing locally and try to use it to address the systemic issues.
One of the things that we did at Ascension, Meredith and I took a group of kids on a civil rights pilgrimage, and we got on the train at Union Station, and there were 16 kids. They were half white and half black, and we got on the train, and I do not do well sleeping on a train car, but we went to Atlanta. We went to Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King's father was. We went to Tuskegee and the Tuskegee Airmen. We stayed at Tuskegee. We went to Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery. And in each of those places, I would watch these kids, and they had read about it in textbooks, but they'd never been there. And one of the great things about doing it when we did, there were still 3 people that they met who were alive. One lady's sister was killed in the 16th Street Baptist church bombing. we had a Tuskegee Airman talk to these kids. And we had a lady who led them around Selma, who was there and marched across the bridge on Bloody Sunday. And those kids heard that, and they were absolutely wonderful the way they responded to these people. I was very proud of our youth group, and I would dare say most of those kids wrote their college essays when they applied to go to college based on that experience when they went on the Civil Rights pilgrimage. That was, I would say that was local. It was a way that the church got involved and helped those kids take an idea that they'd read in textbooks and then experience it, quote, in person. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what we did.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that spirit very, very quickly. When the assassination occurred, as I said, the area around the church was like a bombed out area in London. And one of the first things I discovered after the parents got through to get their kids was that there were folks from our church living in apartments and rooms around the area that were afraid to come out and get food. And so again, we've come back to food very quickly. But one of the first things we did was to get a few folks who were willing to take a chance and go into the area and take food along the way. And one of the results of that ultimately was that our preschool, which continued after all of this went on, was able to expand its feeding program and to get food to people. And it was what's impressed me here this morning is the incredible power of the movements that came out of this and all. But at the same time, on the other end of the scale is that people were getting food who were hungry and didn't have food. So that out of this came a balance in a sense in what we were able to do as we responded. So I appreciate
That's a
those of
great
you who-
comment. Rob, do you want to make one more comment
do.
before we do the video? Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a metaphor that I've been training with the Racial Equity Institute around the country since becoming the first gentleman of St. John Church. I haven't got my parking spot yet, Sari, waiting for that. But they have a powerful metaphor, I think, about that kind of speaks to this question. And the metaphor is that if you're walking along a river one day and you see a fish, a single fish that comes up belly up dead, you might wonder what happened to that fish. You know, where did that fish's life go wrong? Did that fish's family take care of that fish? Did it instill good values in that fish? Did it grow up in the right neighborhood of the pond? And did it know how to work hard and care about its community? And maybe ran with the wrong fish friends at some point. So you might worry about what happened to that single fish. But if the next day you come back and half the fish are belly up dead, what's the question you have to ask? What's wrong with the water? And so I think, in our society, our schools, even our churches are oriented towards fish fixing. Let's fix this fish. And that's important. And as we've heard, it saves lives. And it can be transformative. But the problem if you only fix fish is that you think that the fish deserve the circumstances they're in, and that you don't know the history of what's happening there in the water that has fed this system. And so it'll be like when you walk into a beautiful Bethesda neighborhood, you'll just assume if you don't have a history, oh, well, white people care about the neighborhood. White people, they really, just are more responsible. If that's all you know, if you come here from outer space and you don't have a history about the history behind that many of these neighborhoods have racially restrictive covenants, that black people were literally not allowed to come into many parts of Montgomery County at times. And so if you don't know the history, so that's why I think it is true that you combine them, and you never want to not stay connected with the needs of human beings. But if you can actually, in the metaphor goes also, you can fix an entire lake, or you can fix all the fish in that lake. But the actual majority of the water we deal with, fresh water, is in the groundwater. And so it's connected to every other lake. And so you can fix all of them, but there'll be a whole new generation of fish that come in that will be impacted by the poison and the contamination of the system at an unchanged rate. So I find that metaphor helpful in thinking about this debate back and forth. It's that, and contradictions are good things. If you don't have any contradictions in your life, then it can get pretty boring. So you want contradictions. You want to be engaging in those contradictions of the particular and the universal and how they interact with each other.
Right, and Episcopalians are really good at holding contradictions in tension. So that's part of our ethos. So anyway, the video that we would like to show you really illustrates, I think, both the local level and the systemic level. So I'm going to ask our guests to come down, and Justin will pull down the screen and we'll put it on. Careful of the wires, yeah? Thank you, Adam. Thank you. Thanks, Siri. Okay. All right.
We must be honest about the foundations of the political and economic systems we call America. I love America because of her potential, but I know that America will never even get close to being a more perfect nation until we are honest about the politics of rejection.
I want to tell you about some of the leaders who are building the Poor People's Campaign. Callie Greer from Selma, Alabama, who had to bury her daughter, Venus, because she didn't have health care.
I'm here today to share my daughter Venus' story. Venus discovered a small lump in her breast. She wasn't insured. Venus had to be approved for every prescription and every piece of medical equipment that she needed. I'm standing here today in solidarity with the Poor People's Campaign, because no one should have to bury their child in America because they don't have health care insurance.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am working for with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
I'm a second generation fast food worker, and I've experienced this cycle of poverty firsthand. Growing up, I watched my mother endure long hours of back-breaking labor, doing everything she could to feed me and my sisters. My employer barely pays me enough to pay rent and utilities, let alone the medical expenses with my mother.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
I'm a Vietnam veteran. My only chance of going to college was joining the Army.
It was one thing to know that you didn't have water and you couldn't afford your water. It's a whole nother to find out that they shut off your entire community and none of you matter.
Being poor is not a sin. Poverty is a sin. Being homeless is not a sin. Homelessness is a sin.
This is the largest encampment in Aberdeen. There's about 1,000 people in a town of 16,000 who are homeless.
In my community, we all shut off the day because none of us could afford our water bill. In the time our family was able to afford electricity in the winter, it was very
when there are 38 million poor children, when 60% of African Americans are poor, when 65% of Latinx are poor, when 40% of Asians are poor, when there are 67 million poor white people, we must say, this is not right. Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the street. For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong. Our backs are against the wall. We got no choice but to push.
Followed that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved into the street. Washington Avenue between City Hall and Marjorie closed down. Protesters with the Poor People's Campaign of Indiana.
2 o'clock on the East Coast, 2 o'clock in the middle, 2 o'clock on the West Coast. Away, the historians tell us it's never happened before.
Our communities, Muslim communities, who have joined the Poor People's Campaign to keep count on us.
And our democracy is in trouble. And we come to demand.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
This wall is wrong. It is sinful. $40 billion going into this wall, not into health care.
What we're trying to preserve and what we're trying to do is to protect the water, it's to protect the land, to protect the environment. I'm trying to get my generation involved.
We are in a fight for our lives. Our march, protest, our plant my seeds in good ground. Our vote.
It's not about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It's about the very soul and heart of this nation.
So please join me in thanking our speakers today. And let's think about what we can do about it.